There are moments when life becomes silent and the heart speaks in a way only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala understands. Moments when a person sits alone and something inside begins to whisper a longing, a plea, a turning toward the one who has always been near. This silent whisper is the first seed of dua. It is the heart seeking closeness before it seeks relief. In such moments, many believers wonder why their prayers feel unanswered. They wonder why tears fall without relief, why hope trembles night after night while the world stays still. And slowly, a quiet question rises. Is Allah listening? Why does comfort delay when the heart is trying so hard? The Quran answers these questions gently, not suddenly. One of the most profound stories is that of Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam, whose life teaches that dua is not always answered by altering circumstances. Sometimes it is answered by transforming the heart that prays. Raised in purity, worship, and peace, she grew up enveloped in divine gentleness long before she understood destiny. Her sanctuary taught her the nearness of Allah, where the unseen felt more real than the visible. Hazrat Zakaria alayhi salam would find fruits beside her that did not belong to any season. When he asked where they came from, she answered with simple certainty that they came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Her simple words carried a deep truth. Rizq comes from where no path exists. Even with these early signs of divine nearness, her greatest lessons would arrive through difficulty. She learned that dua is answered not only when life changes, but when the heart changes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises closeness to those who call upon Him. And this closeness often arrives long before relief does. When a believer prays, their voice is not lost in an empty sky. It rises to the one who knows every hidden ache. Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam would one day face a decree no one on earth could understand. Her dua would not erase the test, it would shape her into someone capable of carrying it. Dua is not a transaction, it is surrender. It is proof that the heart still believes in the mercy that never forgets it. And so the story begins in the stillness where dua is born, a reminder that the first answer is often not an event, but awakening. The heart softens, the soul opens, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins preparing a believer long before the test arrives. There are seasons in a believer's life when faith is tested not by hardship itself, but by the spaces between dua and its answer. Those dawns when a believer cries with sincerity, yet rises to a world unchanged. These silent intervals stretch the heart into deeper trust, a trust that does not depend on signs or timings, but on nearness itself. Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam grew up surrounded by signs of divine closeness, yet she, too, had to learn this trust. One day, Hazrat Zakaria alayhi salam found fruits beside her fruits from seasons that had not yet arrived. They were not merely provisions, they were lessons. They taught that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not bound by time or cause, that He can give without a door, without a reason, without a pathway. Witnessing this miracle rekindled hope inside the Prophet who had prayed for a child for years. He was old, his bones weak, and time had carved limitations into his life. But seeing divine generosity granted to her, he whispered his dua again, not because circumstances changed, but because his heart did. He realized that dua is not limited by logic. It is carried by the one who creates without limits. Often Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspires dua through someone else's blessing, not for comparison, but to awaken belief that divine generosity never ends. Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam's youth was filled with signs that the unseen moves long before humans see it. These signs were not simply kindness, they were preparation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was shaping her heart, strengthening it gently, guiding it quietly toward a decree unlike any other. Sometimes believers wonder why small blessings appear unexpectedly, moments of ease in difficulty, sudden calm amid fear, a door opening quietly. These are not coincidences. They are anchor points. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala plans so that when tests arrive, the believer remembers. He was there before, he will be there again. Her sanctuary became a place where trust matured, where her heart became capable of carrying what destiny would place upon it. She learned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees every moment, hears every whisper, and prepares the soul long before He prepares the circumstances. Then came the moment that would change everything. Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam withdrew into deeper solitude, not knowing that destiny was about to unfold. Suddenly, a presence appeared before her. A man stood there, perfect in form, yet carrying an aura that the world could not contain. She did not know it was Hazrat Jibreel alayhi salam. All she saw was a figure in a place where no human should have been. Fear surged through her, and instinctively she sought refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fear does not negate faith, it reveals humanity. Her trembling plea for protection showed her purity and her trust. The angel spoke gently, revealing that he was a messenger sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give her a decree. She would bear a child without a father, without precedent, without explanation the world could grasp. A child who would be a sign to humanity, a prophet, Hazrat Isa alayhi salam. Shocked, she asked how such a thing could happen. Her question was not doubt, it was the natural voice of a human heart standing before the impossible. The angel assured her that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills a thing, it occurs instantly. No process binds Him, no cause limits Him. This moment teaches every believer that dua should not be confined to what seems possible. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not restricted by the laws He created. When He decrees, the world shifts around it. Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam felt fear, confusion, awe, and surrender all at once. She did not yet feel strong or ready, but she remembered what her sanctuary had taught her, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is near, that He provides from where no one expects, that His decree comes with the strength needed to carry it. And so she breathed. She steadied her trembling heart. She allowed the decree to settle inside her like a seed planted by divine wisdom. Her journey was only beginning, but her trust had already taken root. Through her first steps into this extraordinary path, every believer learns that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes a new chapter, He also writes the strength to walk through it. Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam stepped into the quiet days that followed the angel's message with a heart carrying both awe and weight. The decree had settled inside her, but understanding it did not make it easier. As the signs of her pregnancy appeared, she moved into deeper solitude, not because of shame, but because the heart instinctively seeks silence when navigating a destiny beyond understanding. Even the purest hearts tremble when life shifts beyond their control. She felt the life within her grow miraculous yet overwhelming. She wondered how she would face the world, how she would explain the inexplicable, how she would endure eyes that saw only the surface and knew nothing of the unseen. Her silence carried questions too delicate for words. In these moments, dua becomes the refuge of the soul. Sometimes her prayers were whispers, sometimes they were only breaths. Sometimes her tears were her dua. The Quran tells us Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what the womb carries and what the soul hides in fear. Her solitude was filled with divine presence. She walked under a sky that held her story with mercy. She sat on earth that had been commanded to support her. She breathed in an air that belonged to the one who never leaves a believer alone. True surrender began not when everything made sense, but when nothing did. She learned that the heart does not surrender because it understands. It surrenders because it trusts. And trust grows when the soul discovers that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not choose a believer for a trial unless He also prepares the mercy to carry them through it. As the pain of childbirth approached, the trembling inside her grew heavier. She was far from home, far from support, far from familiarity. Pain stripped away every illusion of control. Leaning against the trunk of a palm tree, overwhelmed by fear and agony, she cried a sentence that has echoed through time. She wished she had died before this moment. This was not disbelief, it was humanity at its most fragile, a heart overwhelmed by a test greater than itself. And yet, in that most vulnerable moment, divine mercy descended. A voice gentle, reassuring, called to her not to grieve. A stream appeared at her feet. The dry palm tree softened and released fresh dates. Relief came in the simplest forms, reminding her that the one who wrote her trial had also written her comfort. Pain was not abandonment. It was the prelude to transformation. When the child was born, dawn opened with a softness around her. But the journey was not over. She now had to return to her people, carrying a newborn the world would not understand. Every step toward them felt heavier than childbirth itself. She held her miracle close, whispering dua with each heartbeat for strength, calmness, courage. As she approached, the people turned in shock. Their minds, bound by worldly logic, rushed to judgment. Accusations rose not born from truth, but from assumptions sharpened by ignorance. She heard their voices questioning her purity, her lineage, her devotion, yet she remained silent, not out of helplessness, but obedience. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had commanded her not to speak. Some believers know this pain, the pain of being misunderstood, judged without truth, spoken about without fairness. The instinct to defend oneself is powerful, yet sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks His servant to remain silent so He Himself may speak for them. She simply pointed to the infant. Confusion filled the crowd. How can we speak to a newborn? They asked. Their doubt revealed the limits of human perception. Then the miracle unfolded. Hazrat Isa alayhi salam spoke clear, firm, radiant, with divine permission. He declared himself a servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a prophet, one blessed with prayer, charity, and mercy. He defended his mother with words more powerful than anything she could have uttered. Her silence had been the doorway to a divine defense no human explanation could match. Her honor was restored not through argument, but through a miracle. Through this moment, every believer learns that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects the dignity of those who trust Him, even when the world speaks against them. Though her trial had ended, her heart still carried the memory of fear and isolation. Relief does not erase the shadows of struggle. Healing takes time. Now, holding her newborn, she felt both peace and the quiet ache of what she had endured. Hardship had not merely tested her, it had revealed her strength. It had uncovered the resilience hidden beneath her purity. It had shown her the depth of divine compassion. She realized that the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not always prevent the heart from breaking. Sometimes it arrives to rebuild the heart after it breaks into something stronger, softer, and more deeply connected to Him. The child in her arms was not only a miracle, he was a reminder of every unseen moment of divine care. His presence eased the memories of fear. His innocence washed away the weight of loneliness. Through him, she saw clearly how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had guided every step of her path, seen and unseen. She understood now that dua does not only bring solutions, it brings transformation. The person she was before the trial no longer existed. She emerged with a heart reshaped by divine wisdom, steadied by experience, and softened by surrender. Her silence had taught her how to listen. Her loneliness had taught her how to feel divine closeness. Her trembling beneath the palm tree had taught her how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lifts a believer at the very moment their strength dissolves. She looked back on her journey with gratitude, not only for the miracle, not only for the victory, but for the struggle itself. For without the tears, she would not have tasted the sweetness of divine mercy. Without the fear, she would not have discovered the depth of divine protection. Without the waiting, she would not have understood divine timing. Her journey taught her the most profound truth. The heart that breaks for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the heart He rebuilds with His mercy. In the days that followed the miracle before her people, a new stillness settled into Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam's life. The storm had passed, judgment had dissolved, and awe had replaced accusation. Yet the heart does not immediately forget the nights it trembled. Even when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lifts a hardship, the soul continues to settle for a while, like ripples softening across a disturbed lake. Now she lived moments filled with a calmness that felt different from any peace she had known before. It was not the peace of innocence, it was the peace of survival. The peace of having walked through fear, through silence, through surrender, and discovering that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had held her at every step. As she watched Hazrat Isa alayhi salam rest beside her, she felt a radiance surrounding him. Every breath he took reminded her of the mercy that had carried her through the darkest parts of her journey. This child, who had spoken while still in the cradle, was a sign of divine timing. His existence was the embodiment of Allah's promise that relief does not come early or late, it comes precisely when it is meant to arrive. Her heart began to soften in a new way. She realized she no longer viewed hardship as something frightening or chaotic. She saw it now as something woven with hidden purpose. Before her trial, she thought of difficulty as something that tears apart. Now she knew that difficulty also builds. It opens the heart. It deepens trust. It strips away illusions and anchors the soul in ways comfort never can. She remembered her moment beneath the palm tree when she had cried that she wished for death. That memory no longer brought pain. Instead, it brought understanding. She saw how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had responded not with disappointment, but with gentleness. Relief had appeared at her feet. Nourishment had descended. Comfort had reached her in the exact way she needed it. Her weakest moment had become the moment of divine intimacy. Through this realization, she began to understand something every believer eventually learns. Dua is not simply answered by changing the world outside. It is answered by changing the world inside. The strength she carried now had been born from moments she once feared would break her, and she realized those moments had been the birthplace of her transformation. Even her dua felt different now. In the past, her prayers rose from longing, fear, or uncertainty. Now they rose from closeness. She no longer asked as someone reaching upward. She asked as someone already held. Her prayers were softer, fewer, filled with trust rather than urgency. She understood now that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears the heart long before it speaks. When she reflected on how her journey unfolded, she saw how precisely every detail had been arranged. The stream that appeared, the dates that fell, the command to stay silent, the moment when the newborn would speak. Nothing had been random. Every part of her journey had been synchronized with divine wisdom, and she realized that timing is one of the greatest forms of mercy. Believers often assume delayed answers mean unanswered dua, but her story showed the opposite. Delays are preparation, withholding is protection, waiting is cultivation. The heart must grow into the blessing before the blessing arrives. She now saw that her tears had not been neglected. They had been gathered, cherished, and answered in the form of a miracle she had never imagined. She looked at her child and felt love wash over her in ways that softened every shadow of her past. What once frightened her now felt purposeful. What once overwhelmed her now felt like the foundation of her strength. Blessings often arrive in forms the believer does not expect. And Hazrat Isa alayhi salam was the most tender reminder of this truth. There comes a moment in every believer's journey when the wisdom of their hardship becomes clear, not through explanations, but through clarity that rises within. Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam felt this clarity now. She saw how she had never walked alone. Every fear had been witnessed, every tear had been answered, every step had been guided. She understood now that dua begins its work long before a believer sees its result. Dua transforms, dua strengthens, dua anchors, dua carries the soul through storms with a grace the mind cannot comprehend. This connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala became the treasure she carried, more valuable than ease, more comforting than people, more steady than anything the world could offer. She saw now that hardship had not destroyed her, it had uncovered her. It had shown her who she truly was, someone held more gently by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than she ever imagined. Her gratitude deepened, not only for the relief, not only for the miracle, but for the struggle itself. Without the loneliness, she would not have felt divine companionship. Without the fear, she would not have discovered divine protection. Without the waiting, she would not have understood divine timing. Her entire story had taught her that the heart which breaks for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes the heart He rebuilds with wisdom and mercy. As life moved forward, Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam continued to feel the effects of her transformation. Everything around her remained the same, the sky, the earth, the quiet mornings, but her heart saw it all differently. Hardship no longer frightened her. She saw it now as a visitor that arrives with hidden gifts. She realized that waiting had been one of her greatest teachers. Waiting had softened her soul. Waiting had taught her honesty with herself. Waiting had broken through illusions that she needed to carry her destiny alone. She understood now that waiting was not emptiness. It was active. It was filled with divine movement. While she waited, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had been preparing everything she would need. Hardship also opened her heart to others. It taught her compassion. Those who have felt fear understand the fear of others. Those who have waited understand the waiting of others. Those who have been judged understand the pain of those who are misunderstood. She carried this tenderness with her in every interaction. Her presence itself became a source of ease for others. The heart transformed through hardship does not boast. It simply breathes differently. It moves with humility. It speaks softly. It listens deeply. It lives in remembrance rather than fear. Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam now walked with this kind of heart, a heart anchored in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a heart unshaken by uncertainty, a heart that saw every moment as part of a larger divine design. Her story became a mirror for every believer who walks through difficulty. It teaches that hardship is not a punishment. It is a purification. It removes what clouds the heart. It reveals what strengthens it. It brings the believer closer to the one who controls every breath they take. She now understood the unseen movement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in ways she never understood before. She saw that what seemed silent had been filled with activity. What seemed empty had been filled with wisdom. What seemed closed had been preparing to open in the most beautiful way. Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam held her child close, feeling his warmth. She had been reshaped from within, rebuilt through mercy, strengthened through surrender. And now she carried within her the most precious gift a believer can possess. A heart that knows how deeply it is held by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. With time, she felt the glow of this transformation settle deeper. Dua was no longer something she turned to only in hardship. It became the rhythm of her soul. She understood now that dua is not merely a request. Dua is connection. Dua is healing. Dua is remembrance. Dua is the path that carries a believer toward the one who already knows what they need. She reflected on her journey and saw clearly how dua had accompanied her at every step. From the fear of the unknown to the trembling under the palm tree, from her silence before her people to the miracle that spoke in her defense. Dua had not always changed her circumstances instantly, but it had changed her. And that change had shaped her destiny in ways she never imagined. She realized that dua works in layers. It begins with longing. It continues with patience. It deepens with transformation. And it ends with clarity not only about the world, but about the self. It turns the believer into someone who no longer fears the future because they trust the one who writes it. Every believer who listens to her story learns that dua is never lost. Dua rises even when the voice trembles. Dua is heard even when it is silent. Dua is answered even when the heart feels too broken to hope. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers in ways that reshape destiny and reshape the soul. At night, she would gaze at the stars and feel a serenity that came from knowing her life was part of a design far greater than her understanding. She felt safe in her surrender. She felt guided in her uncertainty. She felt loved in ways that hardship had revealed, but ease could never have shown. In the glow of this understanding, she embraced the final truth of her journey, a truth that every believer carries within their heart. As the days unfolded gently around her, Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam found herself living with a heart that had learned to recognize the subtle movements of divine wisdom. She no longer looked back at her journey with the heaviness it once held. She looked back with tenderness, with understanding, with an awareness that every moment of fear had carried her toward a place of deeper nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She saw now that miracles do not always appear in flashes of light. Sometimes they appear in the quiet way a heart heals, in the quiet way a believer forgives themselves for breaking, in the quiet way a soul begins to breathe again after thinking it never would. She understood that healing is also an answer to dua, even when the healing arrives softly, slowly, almost invisibly. There were moments now when she would sit in the calm of early dawn, holding her child close, and feel a serenity that reached deeper than peace. It felt like certainty, a certainty that came from knowing she was never alone in any part of her story. A certainty that whispered that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had been carrying her long before she ever felt His closeness. And that He would continue carrying her long after her journey became a source of comfort for hearts she would never meet. In those quiet mornings, her thoughts would sometimes drift to the believers who would come after her, those who would read her story in moments of fear, in moments of doubt, in moments of aching silence. She felt a compassion for them, for their struggles, for their unanswered questions, for the weight they would hold inside their own chests. Her story was not preserved as a tale of hardship alone. It was preserved as a lantern for every soul who feels overwhelmed by what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written for them. A lantern for every believer who wonders if they have the strength to keep going. a lantern for every heart that whispers dua into the night and wonders if it is being heard. Through her journey, the believer learns that dua is never lost. Even when the world feels unchanged, the heart is being shaped. Even when the answer feels delayed, the soul is being prepared. Even when the path feels uncertain, the unseen is moving in ways the believer cannot yet perceive. Hazrat Maryam alayha salam understood now that the most beautiful part of dua is not only the moment it is answered. The most beautiful part is the journey it creates within the heart, a journey towards softness, toward trust, toward a closeness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that remains long after the hardship has passed. And so she lived her days with a heart illuminated by that closeness, a heart that understood that every believer is held, a heart that knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is nearer than breath, nearer than fear, nearer than every trembling thought the soul tries to hide. As she looked at her child, she felt gratitude rise within her again. Gratitude not only for the miracle she held, but for the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had carried her to this moment. She felt gratitude for the silence that taught her to listen, for the fear that taught her to trust, for the tears that taught her to pray, for the hardship that taught her who her Lord truly is. In that realization, she understood the deep wisdom behind every believer's journey. Hardship is temporary, fear is temporary, waiting is temporary, but the transformation they create within the heart, that stays. The closeness they cultivate, that stays. The trust they build, that stays. And in her final moments of reflection, she understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. That dua is the thread that connects the believer to their Lord. That dua is the doorway through which mercy flows. That dua is the heart's way of remembering where strength truly comes from. And that dua is answered always in the way that brings the believer closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Her journey teaches the world that the soul is never alone in its longing, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala listens even before the whisper is formed, that He responds even before the believer understands the need, and that every hardship is a step toward a deeper, purer, more unshakable connection with Him. And so the story closes not with the end of her trial, but with the beginning of her certainty, a certainty that every believer is invited to carry, that the one who wrote your story walks with you through every chapter, that the one who hears your dua is closer than your heartbeat, and that the one who lifted Hazrat Maryam alayha salam will lift you too, in the perfect way, at the perfect moment, with a mercy more tender than anything you can imagine. This is where her journey becomes yours, where her strength becomes your reminder, where her surrender becomes your comfort, and where her story whispers gently to every believer's heart. You are held, you are heard, and your dua is already on its way, in the most beautiful form written for your soul. If this reminder touched your heart, share it with someone who might need it today. Drop a comment with one lesson that stayed with you, and don't forget to subscribe for more soul-healing reminders. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ease your path and bless your du'as.